The wind was already picking up by the time Hank Brody crouched beside the rust-stained pump casing behind his barn. The evening air smelled of ozone and wet soil, telltale signs that Kansas weather was about to turn. His old work lamp flickered as he tightened the final bolt on the irrigation pump, the only thing still keeping his southern plot from drying up like a forgotten grave. The barn creaked with every gust, its ancient wooden frame holding on out of sheer stubbornness, much like Hank himself. 68 years old, bones weathered as the land he worked, Hank wasn't about to let another summer thunderstorm stop him from coaxing life out of his crumbling farm. "Come on, girl," he muttered to the pump as he twisted the wrench, knuckles scraped and raw. "Just give me another season." He flicked the switch to power it up. For a moment, the machine groaned to life, sputtering with resistance before giving in to the current. Water gurgled through the pipe. A win, briefly. Then everything went dark. The overhead lamp blinked once, then gave out completely as a sudden crack of thunder split the night. The pump died with a sigh, and the farm fell into silence, save for the wind rattling the metal siding. Somewhere in the distance, lightning flashed behind the ridge, illuminating the field for a breathless second before plunging it back into darkness. Hank stood, shoulders heavy with fatigue, and shuffled toward the barn door. He reached for the flashlight he always kept, hung beside the frame. Batteries dim, but good enough. He aimed it down the gravel path toward the house. That's when he heard it. A sharp, mechanical cough from somewhere out on the dirt road beyond his gate. Then again, engine trouble. Hank narrowed his eyes. Most folks didn't wander down this road, not in weather like this. Hell, even the deer had more sense. He hesitated, then grabbed his slicker and hat off the nail by the door and stepped out into the rain. The storm had grown angrier in minutes. Wind whipped across the fields, bending the tall grass and slapping water across his face as he trudged through the mud. The flashlight beam danced over puddles and fence posts until it caught the glint of chrome. Headlights angled awkwardly off the edge of the road. A Ford F-150. Newer model. Tires half sunk into the shoulder. Hood propped open, engine hissing like a wounded animal. And beside it, cursing under his breath, stood a man in a soaked button-up and jeans, holding a cell phone uselessly to the sky. "Cell service ain't worth a damn out here," Hank called out, raising his voice above the wind. The man looked up, startled. Raindrops glistened on his face as he lowered the phone and forced a sheepish smile. "Didn't mean to bother anyone," he said. "I thought I could make it to E35 before the weather turned. Battery light came on, then the whole damn thing just died." "You're about 6 miles short of the highway and 2 hours too late to beat this storm," Hank replied, approaching cautiously. "Engine turnover at all?" "Nope. Tried twice. Got nothing but warning lights and a weird burning smell." Hank gave a nod, eyes scanning the undercarriage and front grille. "Pop the hood again." The man stepped aside as Hank leaned in. A puff of white smoke rose into the rain, and Hank instinctively reached for a pair of gloves he wasn't wearing. "Name's Hank," he said, not looking up. "Ethan," the man answered, hesitating a beat. "Just Ethan." Hank caught the pause. City type, no doubt. Clean hands, expensive boots already ruined by the Kansas mud, no calluses, no tan line where a wedding ring might have been. Definitely not from Eldridge. "You're lucky you didn't crack a belt," Hank muttered, tugging a wire loose from a melted terminal. "Looks like your alternator's shot. Might have shorted out in the rain. Ford's been putting these too close to the exhaust manifold for years now." "You a mechanic or something?" Ethan asked. "Something," Hank said, standing up and wiping his hands on his jeans. "I got a shop. Not much, but better than freezing out here. You're welcome to come up to the house. I can try to patch something together so you can get moving in the morning." Ethan hesitated, glancing at the storm-churned sky, then back to the dark outline of Hank's barn in the distance. "I don't want to be a bother." "Too late for that," Hank said dryly. "You're already broke down in my ditch." Ethan huffed a quiet laugh, then nodded. "All right, thanks. I appreciate it." The two men walked in silence through the rain, the only sounds the squelch of boots and the hiss of wind across the wheat stubble. By the time they reached Hank's workshop, an old converted tool shed with a leaky roof and one flickering overhead bulb, they were soaked to the bone. Inside, Hank lit an old gas heater and handed Ethan a towel from a crate labeled "dog rags." The man took it gratefully, Nice place, Ethan offered, eyes scanning the walls lined with rusted parts, stripped alternators, and rows of hand-labeled coffee cans filled with bolts. Built it myself after the co-op folded, Hank said offhandedly, pulling out a set of tools. Not much left after that, but you make do. Ethan looked up. Co-op? Yeah, used to be a big one in town, Brody Agricultural Co-op. My family started it back in '82. It kept this town alive for over 30 years. The way Hank said it, steady, quiet, matter of fact, carried the weight of 100 sleepless nights and one long betrayal. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, pretending to examine the engine part Hank had set on the bench. That name, he said slowly. Brody, sounds familiar. Probably read it in the obituaries, Hank said, not missing a beat. Ethan gave a half smile but said nothing more. By midnight, Hank had managed to clean the connectors, solder a temporary bridge for the power relay, and yank a replacement alternator from an old Massey Ferguson tractor that hadn't run since 2009. Not pretty, Hank said, handing Ethan a mug of black coffee. But it should get you to a real mechanic, if you don't stop along the way. Ethan took the coffee with both hands. Thanks, Hank, seriously. I owe you one. No charge, Hank replied, but the storm's getting worse. Roads are flooding. You're not going anywhere tonight. I can sleep in the truck. You'll freeze, Hank said simply. Come up to the house. Got a spare couch. It ain't the Ritz, but it don't leak. Ethan hesitated. That's very kind of you. It's not kindness, Hank said, pulling on his coat. It's Kansas. Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the siding on the barn. As they walked toward the farmhouse, neither man spoke. Ethan didn't ask questions. Hank didn't offer answers. They were just two silhouettes moving through rain and memory, one trying to outrun his past, the other still living in its shadow. And neither of them had the faintest clue how deeply their lives had already been tied together. Not yet. The early morning light hadn't yet broken over the hills of Eldridge when Hank Brody rolled up the door to his old equipment shed. The hinges groaned in protest, like everything else on the farm that hadn't been oiled in years. Cold air spilled into the cluttered space, brushing over rusted wrenches, motor oil cans, and shelves stacked with dusty parts long since out of circulation. In the corner sat a busted riding mower Hank had meant to fix 2 summers ago. Above it, a faded metal sign still read, Brody Agricultural Co-op, Equipment Depot. He flicked on a hanging shop light that buzzed and blinked before settling into a dim yellow glow. Ethan Caldwell, still damp from the storm, stepped inside behind him, his arms crossed tight over his chest. Quite the museum you've got here, Ethan said, glancing around the room. I prefer archive, Hank muttered, kneeling beside a low shelf. Museum makes it sound like nothing in here works. Ethan gave a faint smile and crouched near the workbench, his eyes scanning the shelves of drive belts and circuit boards. Mind if I take a look while you dig around? Be my guest. Just don't touch anything with frayed wiring unless you're feeling lucky. As Ethan poked gently at a busted carburetor, Hank located a spare ignition coil from a bin marked F150/F250-2000s, blew off the dust, and laid it on the bench. This might not be a perfect match, but it'll get your truck started, long enough to limp back to town. You're a miracle worker, Ethan said. Hard to find someone who still knows how to fix things by hand. That's because most folks are too busy trying to upgrade rather than maintain. Hank chuckled dryly, wiping grease from the coil housing with an old t-shirt. Funny how everything these days is designed to break just soon enough to make you buy a new one. Ethan studied him. You ever consider opening a full repair shop? Seems like you could run a good one. I did once, in a way. Hank nodded toward the faded co-op sign. Used to be a time when we fixed more than machines around here. We fixed futures. Ethan followed his gaze. Brody Agricultural Co-op, he read aloud, testing the words like they had weight. That was yours? Wasn't just mine, Hank said quietly, taking a seat on a creaky stool. It belonged to the whole valley. Farmers pooled what little we had, bought seed and feed in bulk, shared equipment, helped each other stay afloat during bad harvests. For a while, it worked. Ethan leaned in, genuinely intrigued. So, what happened? What always happens? Hank said, voice heavy with the bitterness of hindsight. Someone with a shiny suit and a spreadsheet convinced us we needed to scale. Said the only way to compete with the big boys was to take on investment capital. At first, it was loans. Then came partnerships. Pretty soon, decisions were being made in boardrooms hundreds of miles from the soil we stood on. He stood again, rubbing a kink from his back. Eventually, the co-op couldn't keep up with the terms they kept changing. We were squeezed out, folded like a lawn chair in a windstorm. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. That's tough. Sorry you had to go through that. Wasn't just me, Hank corrected. Dozens of families lost their livelihoods. Some left town. Some drank themselves into early graves. Others... He paused, catching himself. Just kept going. Best we could. There was a long silence between them, broken only by the occasional drip from a cracked gutter outside. Out in the pale light beyond the shed door, the old windmill loomed like a ghost. Its blades had stilled years ago, rusted in place, but the frame remained defiantly upright, like a spine refusing to bend. Ethan walked closer to the open doorway and stared at the structure. I passed that on the way in. Didn't realize it was part of the property. Hank nodded. Used to pump water for the fields, back before we put in the electric irrigation. When the co-op collapsed, the water rights got tied up in litigation. Now the fields go dry while that thing just rusts away. Ethan squinted. Brody Co-op. I feel like I've heard that name before, somewhere in an industry report or a conference presentation maybe. Wouldn't surprise me, Hank said, tone clipped. Plenty of investment firms studied our downfall like it was a case study in poor rural management. Funny thing is, nobody bothered asking us what really happened. Ethan was quiet, choosing his next words carefully. Do you ever think it could have gone differently? Every damn day, Hank replied. He turned back to the workbench, opening a drawer and grabbing a ratchet. But regrets like rust, spreads fast if you don't stay on top of it. Ethan nodded slowly, hands in his pockets. I've read about co-ops like yours. Most never got beyond their first 5 years. You must have done something right to last as long as you did. That got a look from Hank, a curious one. You sure know a lot about farming structures for a guy who claims to work in logistics. Ethan gave a nonchalant shrug. I've dabbled, interned at an AG consultancy during business school, had to learn the models. Hank studied him carefully but said nothing, just handed over the ignition coil. Here, let's go see if this gets your beast back to life. The two men walked back through the muddy yard toward the ford. The storm clouds had passed, leaving behind a low-hanging mist and a layer of dew that shimmered on the grass. Hank popped the hood while Ethan held a flashlight. So, Hank said, elbow deep in engine wires, what kind of business you in these days? Still logistics, Ethan lied smoothly. Agri-distribution, mostly helping food suppliers streamline delivery routes and reduce spoilage. Sounds fancy. It's mostly spreadsheets and headaches. Hank chuckled, connecting the coil. Well, whatever pays the bills. You have family, Mr. Brody? Ethan asked suddenly. Hank didn't look up. One daughter, lives in Tulsa, works for a legal aid nonprofit. Bright, tough as nails. Doesn't quite get why her old man's still fixing tractors in a town that forgot him. Sounds like she cares. She does, just not about farming. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but stopped short. There was a weight to Hank's words, a quiet dignity in his refusal to say more. So he let it go. Hank finished the last bolt, wiped his hands, and stepped back. Give it a go. Ethan climbed into the driver's seat, turned the key, and the truck roared to life with a low, sputtering growl that soon evened into a steady hum. He exhaled in relief. You weren't kidding. Miracle worker. Just a man with too many hours and not enough excuses to give up. Ethan stepped out, slamming the door gently behind him. I owe you big for this. No, Hank said flatly, wiping his hands with a rag. You don't owe me a thing. Just don't forget what it feels like to be stuck in the dark with nowhere to turn. The words hit harder than they should have. Ethan nodded solemnly. As the two men stood in the early morning hush, the windmill groaned faintly in the distance, one rusted blade twitching like it might move again. "Ever think of fixing that up?" Ethan asked, gesturing to it. "I've thought about it," Hank said, his voice distant. "But some things you leave broken, so you don't forget what broke them." Ethan didn't have a reply. The sky above them slowly lightened into pale blue as a new day began over Eldridge. The wind picked up slightly, whispering through the fields that had once fed a town, and now only remembered it. The morning sun had not yet crept over the hills of Eldridge, and the storm's aftermath still lingered in the air. Mud puddles clung to the dirt roads like forgotten regrets, and the power lines hummed softly in the quiet aftermath. Inside the farmhouse, the low murmur of a kettle on the stove and the rhythmic click of utensils signaled the start of another day in Hank Brody's world. He stood at the kitchen counter, stirring sugar into a chipped mug of coffee, when the familiar ringtone of his old landline broke the silence. Only a few people ever called the house phone anymore. Hank wiped his hands on a dish towel and picked it up. Brody residence. "Dad?" Emily's voice was like a gust of warm air, always welcome, but always catching him slightly off guard. "Hey, Em," he said, a smile forming unconsciously. "Everything all right?" "I should be asking you that," she replied. "You sounded tired the other night." Hank glanced out the window at the drenched gravel driveway, where Ethan Caldwell's mud-splattered Ford F-150 sat like a monument to misfortune. "Had a surprise guest last night. Some fella got stuck in the storm. His truck gave out just past the windmill, so I helped him tow it in." "Dad." Emily's tone shifted, cautious now. "You didn't bring a stranger into the house, did you?" Hank chuckled. "Not much choice with that kind of rain. Roads were flooded. He seemed decent enough. Said his name's Ethan." There was a pause. "Ethan what?" Hank shrugged as if she could see it. "Didn't say, didn't ask." On the other end of the line, Emily exhaled. "Well, I hope he's not with Agrisphere." Hank stiffened, the name catching in his chest like a splinter in softwood. "Why would he be with Agrisphere?" "I've been looking into them lately. There's a land dispute brewing down here in Tulsa. Agrisphere's been trying to rezone old farmland for commercial development, claiming some technical clause in the original contracts. I dug deeper and found a few things. Let's just say it wouldn't surprise me if they were pulling the same stunt in Kansas a decade ago." The name lingered in the air long after she ended the call. Agrisphere, that ghost of a corporation, the puppet master, behind closed doors during the fall of Brody Co-op. It hadn't crossed his lips in years, but the sound of it still triggered a wave of unease. Hank hung up the phone and turned toward the living room, where the faint creaking of the stairs signaled Ethan's descent. Ethan stepped into the kitchen, looking refreshed, his damp clothes from the night before neatly draped over a nearby chair. "Smells like coffee," he said. "Hope I'm not intruding too long." "Not at all," Hank replied, pushing a mug across the table. "Roads are still a mess. Probably best you wait a few more hours." "Appreciate it," Ethan said, sitting. He took a sip of coffee, then looked toward the window. "That windmill out there, it caught my eye last night." Hank followed his gaze. "Hasn't spun right since 15. Was part of the Brody Co-op, back when this town still believed in sharing risk and reward." Ethan tilted his head. "Brody Co-op." His voice was careful, neutral. "That name sounds familiar." Hank raised an eyebrow. "You invest in farming communities, Mr. Ethan." Ethan laughed lightly. "I dabble in ag tech ventures, mostly from the finance side. Nothing hands-on like this." Hank said nothing, letting the silence stretch, his eyes fixed on the windmill like it held answers. "The co-op," Hank said after a beat, "wasn't just a business. It was a promise. Every farmer in Eldridge pooled their resources, equipment, seeds, water rights. We weren't rich, but we were steady. And then, we weren't." "What happened?" Ethan asked, taking another sip. "Same thing that always happens," Hank said flatly. "Outside money showed up with smiles and spreadsheets, talked about modernization, efficiency, market expansion. We signed the papers. 6 months later, we were bankrupt." Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Sounds like poor management." "Sounds like someone pulled the rug out from under us," Hank corrected. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The kettle let out a soft hiss as if uneasy with the direction of the conversation. "Well," Ethan said finally, rising to his feet, "I should check on my truck. I'll see if the roads are clearing." "You do that," Hank murmured. Later that afternoon, the rain returned, lighter this time, more a drizzle than a downpour. Hank stood on the porch, watching Ethan tinker under the hood of the F-150. He moved with surprising precision, clearly no stranger to the mechanics of modern trucks. Hank respected that. For all his suspicions, the man knew engines. By dusk, it became obvious the truck wasn't going anywhere tonight. "The ignition coil's toast," Hank announced after checking it himself. "Water got in deep. I could jury-rig something, but it wouldn't hold past a few miles." Ethan exhaled, glancing down the road. "So I'm stuck?" "Afraid so," Hank said. "Got a guest room upstairs. You're welcome to it." "I wouldn't want to impose." "You already did," Hank replied dryly. "Might as well finish the job." That night, Ethan thanked him again and climbed the stairs, carrying his overnight bag and jacket. Hank stayed behind, tidying up the living room. As he lifted the jacket from the back of the chair, something slipped from the inside pocket and landed on the hardwood with a soft thud. Hank bent to retrieve it. It was a black leather card holder, sleek, polished, expensive-looking. Inside was a single business card. His heart stuttered as he read it. Ethan Caldwell, Chief Executive Officer, Agrosphere, Inc. Hank stood frozen, the words searing into his brain like hot iron on cattle hide. All at once, the room seemed to narrow, the air growing heavy around him. This wasn't just a stranded traveler. This was him. The man at the top of the very empire that had gutted Eldridge, shuttered the co-op, and walked away with clean hands. The image of that smiling young executive flashed through Hank's memory. Press conferences streamed on a laptop in the co-op boardroom, grainy screenshots of investment briefings, a name on a press release that no one in town wanted to believe meant what it did. And now, that man was sleeping upstairs in the same house he'd helped destroy. Hank slid the card back into the wallet and tucked the jacket neatly over the chair. He didn't slam anything. He didn't speak. He simply sat back in his old recliner, staring at the quiet staircase, his jaw set like stone. Tomorrow would come, and with it, the truth. Sleep never came that night. Hank sat in the dim glow of the kitchen lamp, his weathered hands clasped tightly around a chipped ceramic mug of black coffee. The rain had quieted to a soft tapping on the windows, but inside the farmhouse, a storm brewed just as fiercely. Upstairs, the man who unknowingly lit the match, Ethan Caldwell, slept soundly beneath Hank's own roof. Hank hadn't moved from his seat since finding the business card. The name printed in clean, confident letters stared up at him like a ghost. Ethan Caldwell, CEO, Agrosphere, Inc. He turned the card over in his hands again and again, as though doing so might change the words or erase the years between them. Memories began to surge up like floodwater breaching a levee. 10 years ago, that name had shown up in a press release Hank had almost ignored. A young executive, fresh out of a fast-track finance program, making waves in the agricultural investment world. At the time, Hank had barely noticed, but now, with the face to match, it all came rushing back with brutal clarity. The Brody Agricultural Co-op had been a cornerstone of Eldridge for over 3 decades. A symbol of independence and mutual survival, the cooperative had allowed local farmers to pool resources, negotiate prices, and weather tough seasons together. Hank, once its elected president, had believed in it more than he believed in the banking system or even the government. But everything changed the year Agrosphere came knocking. They came dressed not in suits, but in casual button-downs and fleece vests. They spoke the local dialect of hope and prosperity, preaching efficiency and market access, promising infrastructure upgrades, better distribution channels, even new cold storage units. A partnership, they called it, a future-proof solution for rural agriculture. Hank remembered sitting in the old co-op meeting hall, the clatter of folding chairs, the smell of coffee and manure. Farmers he'd known since boyhood leaned forward, hungry for salvation after a string of hard harvests. And Agrosphere delivered a pitch wrapped in slick presentations and buzzwords. But beneath all that polish was a wedge, one designed to split trust and sow doubt. "Your current model isn't sustainable," one representative had said during a particularly tense meeting. Hank couldn't remember his name, but he remembered the way he deferred to another man on a video call. a younger man with sharp blue eyes and the smooth assurance of someone who had never gotten dirt under his nails. That man had been Ethan Caldwell. In the memory, Ethan spoke confidently about capital optimization and strategic reallocation of assets. He'd explained that under a new structure, the cooperative would no longer need to manage its own accounts or negotiate with suppliers. Agrosphere would do that on their behalf. All they had to do was sign. At the time, Hank had voiced his concerns. What happens when we no longer control the purse strings? What leverage do we have if things go south? Ethan had smiled through the screen. Mr. Brody, you're looking at this like a farmer. We're offering you the tools to think like a stakeholder. Those words had stayed with Hank. Stakeholder. It sounded empowering at the time, but it had meant surrender. A few weeks later, the contract was signed. Hank had been the last holdout. The other members, desperate and misled, had begged him to reconsider. Walter Finch, his oldest friend, had argued late into the night. Just sign it, Hank. We don't have another choice. So he did. With a pen that shook in his grip, Hank Brody put his name to the dissolution of the Brody Agricultural Co-op as they had known it. Within 6 months, Agrosphere restructured the funding, sold off shared equipment, and quietly terminated long-standing local supplier agreements. Then came the layoffs and the closures. The co-op's land was divided, parceled off to partner farms that were nothing more than Agrosphere-owned operations with local names slapped on the signs. Within a year, the name Brody meant nothing in the county court records. It was a ghost printed in old leases and archived newsletters. And Ethan Caldwell's name rose in parallel, his face appearing in agricultural tech magazines, heralded as a visionary in the industry. Tonight, Hank saw it all differently. Every pressured meeting, every vague promise, every delay in disbursement. It had all been by design. He stood and walked to the living room, where a battered filing cabinet leaned against the far wall. He opened the bottom drawer, digging through a forest of paper until he pulled out a folder labeled Co-op Contracts 2015. The pages inside were worn at the edges, annotated in his own handwriting. There, near the back, he found the signature page. Ethan Caldwell's name was there too, not as a direct signatory, but as the authorized representative of the investment board. Hank hadn't noticed back then. The print had been small, buried in legal language that had taken hours to decipher. But there it was. "You bastard," Hank muttered, his voice hoarse with emotion. He slammed the folder shut, the echo startling in the silent room. The wind outside picked up again, rattling the windows like angry fingers tapping on glass. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked softly. Hank froze, listening. No more movement. Perhaps Ethan had turned in his sleep, or perhaps he sensed something was amiss. Didn't matter. Hank set the folder down and returned to the kitchen. The business card still lay on the table. He stared at it for a long time before finally slipping it into the front pocket of his flannel shirt. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow, this man would wake up to breakfast and a reckoning. Tonight, the ghosts would sit with Hank a little longer. The morning sunlight spilled gently through the faded curtains of Hank's farmhouse, casting long golden beams across the worn hardwood floor. Outside, the sky had softened to a clear Kansas blue, as if the storm from the night before had never happened. Birds chirped somewhere beyond the barn, and the faint clinking of metal echoed from the kitchen below. Ethan rubbed the sleep from his eyes and sat up on the creaky guest bed, still wrapped in flannel sheets that smelled faintly of wood smoke and linseed oil. His body ached in unfamiliar places, partly from the awkward sleep, partly from the strange tension that had hung over him ever since he arrived at this place. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something about this farm, about the man who had taken him in, felt heavy, like stepping into a house that remembered everything you didn't want to. He descended the stairs slowly, uncertain of what to expect. The living room was empty, except for the ticking of a wall clock and the smell of bacon and black coffee. In the kitchen, Hank stood at the stove, his back to Ethan, cracking eggs into a cast-iron skillet like he had done it every morning for 50 years. "Morning," Ethan offered, his voice a little hoarse. Hank nodded without turning around. "Coffee's hot. Cups are in the cabinet over the sink." Ethan poured himself a cup and leaned against the counter, watching Hank work in silence. The tension in the room was tangible now, like a thick fog that hadn't burned off with the dawn. Hank moved with quiet efficiency, setting a plate of scrambled eggs, bacon, and toast on the table without a word. Ethan sat down and muttered a quiet, "Thanks." For the next 15 minutes, they ate in near silence. The only sounds were the scraping of forks on ceramic and the occasional sip of coffee. Ethan tried to make small talk, a comment about the storm, a compliment on the eggs, but Hank responded with short nods or one-word replies. It wasn't rude, exactly, just distant. Finally, Ethan pushed his empty plate aside and reached into the inside pocket of his coat, pulling out a folded bill. "I appreciate the help last night, Mr. Brody. I can't tell you how much. Please, take this for the parts and the trouble." Hank didn't even glance at the money. He just wiped his hands on a dish towel and walked to the door, opening it to the wide expanse of the prairie outside. The wind caught the screen, making it creak slightly. "I didn't help you for money," Hank said, voice flat. "Out here, when someone's stuck in a storm, you help them. Doesn't matter who they are." Ethan hesitated, then folded the money and placed it on the edge of the table anyway. "Well, still, if you ever change your mind." Hank said nothing, just stood in the doorway, eyes scanning the distant fields like he was looking for something long gone. Ethan gathered his things and stepped out onto the porch. His truck sat in the driveway, engine hood down and dry now, thanks to Hank's midnight repairs. The wind had dried the mud, and the sky had returned to the kind of endless blue that only places like Kansas could produce. He took one last look at the house, its sagging roof, the creaking windmill, the ancient red barn, and offered a polite nod. "Take care, Mr. Brody. You too," Hank replied, still not meeting his eyes. Ethan climbed into the truck, started the engine, and pulled out slowly onto the gravel road that led back toward town. The road was still slick in places, puddles catching the sun like shards of glass. He drove in silence, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had taken root in his gut. A few minutes later, as the truck rounded a bend, Ethan caught sight of an old, rusted sign just off the road, barely visible behind a thicket of dry brush. Instinctively, he slowed and brought the truck to a crawl. The sign was rectangular, the white paint peeling from decades of exposure. Faded red lettering still managed to be legible beneath the grime and time. Brody Agricultural Co-op, established, 1982, closed 2015. His stomach dropped. He hit the brakes and stared at the sign, heart thudding in his chest. Brody. That name again. Brody Co-op. It wasn't just a coincidence, he remembered now. Back when he'd still been an up-and-coming strategist at Agrisphere, there had been a portfolio of rural investments flagged for strategic realignment. One of them had been a co-op in Kansas, underperforming, too community-oriented, resistant to corporate partnerships. His team had deemed it a liability. There had been a vote, a decision. Funding was withdrawn. The co-op folded within months. But he hadn't remembered the name until now. Brody, he whispered, his breath fogging the windshield. God. It hit him all at once. The barn, the tools, the windmill, the man. Hank Brody. He felt like throwing up. The sign, weathered and forgotten, stood like a headstone for something that once thrived, something he had helped kill without ever setting foot here. He had stayed in that man's house, eaten his food, slept under his roof, and never realized. He sat behind the wheel, gripping it tightly, trying to steady himself. The truck idled. A bird chirped somewhere in the distance. The prairie stretched out, quiet and unassuming, bearing witness to things that had long since faded from headlines, but never from memory. He didn't know whether to turn around or keep driving, but whatever he chose next, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. The sky over Eldridge was a pale gray, the kind that warned of rain without promising it. Hank Brody stepped off his porch and zipped up his canvas coat, his boots sinking slightly into the damp gravel of his driveway. His thoughts were a storm of their own, faster, darker, more relentless than the clouds above. He hadn't slept since the night Ethan left. His mind kept circling the same truth, like a vulture over an unburied secret. Ethan Caldwell, CEO of Agrisphere, was the man who'd driven the final nail into the coffin of the Brody Co-op. The same man who had stood in his kitchen, complimented his tools, and eaten his eggs. Hank had bitten his tongue until it nearly bled, but silence was no longer an option. He needed clarity. And there was only one man who had been there in the end: Walter Finch. Walter lived just outside town in a small modular home that leaned slightly to one side, as though it too carried the weight of memories. The yard was cluttered with rusting tractors and forgotten ambitions. Hank pulled into the gravel driveway and killed the engine. For a moment, he sat there staring at the front door, rehearsing how this conversation might go. But nothing about this situation lent itself to rehearsal. He knocked twice. The door opened slowly. "Well, I'll be damned," Walter muttered, pulling the door open wider. "If it ain't the last honest farmer in Eldridge." "Morning, Walt," Hank replied with a weary nod. "Got a minute?" Walter grinned and stepped aside. "For you? Always." The inside of Walter's place smelled like coffee grounds and old paper. His kitchen table was covered in stacks of manila folders, envelopes, and dusty ledgers. A pair of reading glasses sat atop a half-finished crossword. It was like walking into the wreckage of an office that time forgot. "Still digging through the past?" Hank asked, nodding toward the piles. "Some things don't stay buried, no matter how deep you shove them," Walter replied. "Have a seat. You look like hell." Hank sat down and folded his hands together. "I need to ask you about Ethan Caldwell." Walter froze mid-pour as he was filling 2 chipped mugs with coffee. The name hit like a cold wind through an open door. "Didn't think I'd hear that name come out of your mouth again," Walter said, setting down the pot. "What's this about?" "He showed up," Hank said simply. "Truck broke down in the storm the other night. I helped him. Didn't even realize who he was until I found his business card in his coat." Walter let out a low whistle. "The universe sure has a sick sense of humor." "That's one way to put it." They sipped their coffee in silence for a moment before Hank leaned in. "I need to know, Walt. Back in 2015, when the co-op went under. You remember that last meeting we had with the investors?" Walter's eyes narrowed. "Of course I do. You mean that snake from Kansas City? The one who looked like he sold souls part-time? Do you remember if Ethan Caldwell's name came up? Officially?" Walter rose from his chair without answering. He shuffled over to a tall filing cabinet wedged in the corner of the room. After tugging open a stubborn drawer, he rifled through a thick stack of records until he pulled out a thin blue folder marked Transfer Agreement, 2015. He brought it to the table, opened it, and pointed at the 3rd page. There, printed in ink that had faded only slightly over time, was the name Ethan Caldwell, Executive Director of Portfolio Strategy, Agrosphere Inc. Hank stared at it in silence. The room felt suddenly too small, too hot. All the air seemed to rush out of it at once. "So it's real," Hank muttered. "I wasn't imagining it." "No, you weren't," Walter said quietly. "He was the one. I didn't connect the dots until later. New title, different haircut, the usual corporate camouflage. But that was him. He came in smiling, talking about streamlining resources, maximizing returns, all the consultant buzzwords. Then we all signed that deal thinking we'd stay afloat. Instead, they cut us loose." Hank leaned back, rubbing his temples. "I remember signing that transfer under pressure. They made it sound like the only way out. They wanted your land, Hank, and your distribution network. Once they had that, the rest of us were disposable." The silence that followed was heavier than grief. It was the sound of 2 men reliving the quiet erosion of something they had built with their own hands. "I should have fought harder," Hank said. "I should have known." Walter shook his head. "They buried it under legalese and promises. None of us saw it coming until it was too late." Hank stood and paced the room. His shoulders were tight, fists clenched. "And now he shows up on my road, acting like just another stranded traveler." "Maybe he didn't recognize you either," Walter offered. "Oh, he didn't," Hank replied. "But now I can't unsee it. I can't just let it go, Walt." Walter nodded. "Then don't." "I'm done being quiet," Hank said, voice hardening. "They took our farms, our community. We let it happen because we trusted the wrong people. But I've got his name. I've got his card. And if I dig, I'll find more." Walter stood up and extended his hand. "Then I'll help you dig." Their grip was firm, calloused hands wrapped in the shared burden of betrayal and resolve. Something passed between them in that moment, not just history, but purpose. As Hank stepped out onto the porch again, the wind had picked up. The clouds had thickened into something more serious, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel powerless beneath them. He had a name, he had proof, and he wasn't alone. The sun had just begun to climb over the Kansas plains, casting long golden streaks across the weathered wood of Hank Brody's farmhouse. The morning was still and cold, but Hank was already out back, splitting firewood. His shoulders moved with the rhythm of a man who had done the same thing every morning for decades, methodical, controlled, and quiet. But his mind wasn't quiet. The weight of last night's conversation with Walter still sat heavy in his chest. He had the name. He had the confirmation. The man who parked his shiny Ford F-150 in front of his barn during a storm, the man who thanked him for his hospitality, was the very person who'd pulled the plug on the only thing Hank had ever built with his own hands. And he'd said nothing. Nothing. The sound of his phone vibrating on the windowsill snapped him from his thoughts. He wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped inside, picking it up just as the caller ID flashed. Emily. "Hey, kiddo," he answered, his voice soft but scratchy from the dry air. "Dad, you've got a second?" Emily's voice came through crisp, but with a nervous undertone. "I just got something. It's about Agrosphere." That name hit Hank like a sudden gust of wind through an open window. He leaned against the kitchen counter, gripping the phone tighter. "Go ahead," he said, heart starting to race. "I got access to some internal reports," she continued. "Part of the case I'm working on. Land acquisition lawsuits in rural Oklahoma. Turns out Agrosphere is under federal investigation. USDA's involved. There's suspicion of coercive land deals, ghost subsidiaries, shell buyouts, the works." She paused, then her tone shifted, sharper now, more focused. "Dad, there's more. In the appendix, there's a section that lists impacted local cooperatives. Guess which name showed up?" Hank closed his eyes. "Brody Agricultural Co-op," she said. "Shut down in 2015. File marked liquidation under hostile restructuring. There's a cross-reference. Says, strategic recommendation, Caldwell. That's in your files, Dad. Ethan Caldwell." He remained silent, staring at the dented kettle on the stove like it might suddenly boil over. The kitchen had gone still. Not even the wind outside dared to move. Emily's voice softened. "Dad, was he there? I mean, the guy, the one who shut it all down?" Hank swallowed. "He was here, stayed the night. Truck broke down in the storm. I helped him. Didn't recognize him right away, not until later." "You're telling me Ethan Caldwell was in your house?" Emily's voice rose. "And you didn't say anything?" "I didn't know until I saw his business card. It fell out of his jacket. By then he was gone." Emily took a long breath on the other end. "Dad, you should have called me, or someone." "I know," he said. "I know I should have." There was another pause, then her voice, quieter now. "Why didn't you?" "I think part of me just froze. I wasn't ready to face all that again. Seeing him, he didn't even know who I was. That kind of indifference, Em, it cuts deeper than anything." She was silent for a moment, then, "I get it. But Dad, this is your chance. Our chance. You're not alone in this. You never were, and you sure as hell don't have to stay silent now." Hank sank into the chair by the window, the same chair Mary used to sit in with her tea back when everything was still okay. He stared out at the brittle fields beyond, the ones that used to bloom under the co-op's banner. What was left now? "I've spent years trying to forget that chapter," he said. "But it's not going anywhere, is it?" "No," Emily replied, "because it still hurts people, and if we don't speak up, they'll do it again, to someone else." A thin smile cracked on Hank's face, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You always were the fighter in this family." "I got it from you," she said. The line fell into a comfortable silence, a silence of understanding. Then Emily spoke again, her tone firm now. "If you have anything, papers, contracts, anything from back then, we need it. I've got a journalist friend working with us. She's been tracking Agrosphere for months. This could crack things wide open. I'll dig through the shed, Hank said. There's a lockbox in the rafters. Hasn't been opened in 10 years. That's a start. I'll call you when I find something. Good, Emily said. And Dad? Yeah? I'm proud of you. The call ended, and Hank set the phone down, staring at the screen for a long time after the line had gone dead. Then he stood, grabbed his coat, and headed toward the shed. The past might have been buried, but it hadn't been forgotten. Not anymore. The Eldridge Sheriff's Office hadn't changed much in the last 20 years. Same creaky screen door that slapped shut too hard, same sun-bleached "Support Your Local Farmers" poster on the wall, and the same worn linoleum that Hank had scuffed back when he used to stop in to post co-op announcements on the town board. It was a building that held the scent of coffee and old files, and memories he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. But that morning, Hank Brody pushed through that screen door with a purpose. Sheriff Ray Duncan was sitting behind his desk, booted feet up, reading a county report. He glanced up over his glasses and blinked in surprise. Well, damn, Hank Brody. Either there's a parade coming to town or something's got you riled up. Hank gave a half-hearted grin. Let's just say the past decided to show up on my doorstep in a broken-down Ford. Ray sat up, lowering his boots and setting aside the papers. Sit. What's going on? Hank pulled up a chair, the wood legs scraping across the linoleum. He didn't waste time. I had a visitor the other night. Name's Ethan Caldwell. Ray's brow furrowed. That name rings a bell. Hank nodded slowly. It should. He's the CEO of Agrosphere, the one who signed off on the funding withdrawal that tanked the co-op 10 years ago. The sheriff let out a slow whistle. You're kidding? I wish I were, Hank muttered. He was stranded out by the road during the storm. Truck broke down. I didn't know who he was at first. Hell, he didn't know who I was either, but I saw his ID after he went to bed, and everything started lining up. The way he talked about investments, the way he asked about the co-op like he was testing the water. Ray rubbed a hand across his chin. You're saying he was snooping? I think he was feeling me out. Not sure if it was guilt or arrogance, but the man didn't land in Eldridge by accident. Ray leaned back. Well, I'll be damned. So what are you here for, Hank? You want me to throw him in jail for bad decisions? Hank cracked a dry smile. I'm here because I want to reopen the past. I want to bring this out into the light. You remember what happened as well as I do. The co-op didn't just collapse. It was sabotaged, piece by piece, from the outside. Ray's eyes darkened slightly, old frustrations resurfacing. You're not wrong. I tried to push for an inquiry back then, but you know how it went. No one wanted to touch it. County officials claimed it was just market correction. Investors pulled strings. Even when those internal emails surfaced, Hank looked up sharply. Emails? Ray hesitated. Yeah, someone, anonymous, leaked a handful of internal communications from Agrosphere. Showed up in my inbox in the middle of the night. No return address. They talked about deleveraging local liabilities and extracting short-term ROI regardless of community backlash. Your co-op was mentioned by name in one. I forwarded them to the state DA's office. Never heard a word back. You still have them? Hank asked. Ray opened his drawer, pulled out a slim file folder and slid it across the desk. I keep a copy. Call it stubbornness. Or maybe I just knew someday you'd walk in here like this. Hank opened the folder. There they were, 3 emails, each one stamped with an internal Agrosphere address, cold as a scalpel. One of them dated just a week before the board voted to pull funding from Brody Co-op. Another discussed accelerating shutdown timelines in underperforming rural collectives. And the last was signed by Ethan Caldwell himself. Hank's jaw clenched. The signature on that email was burned into his memory now. This is more than enough to get people asking questions again, Hank said, especially if I can gather more. Financial reports, meeting minutes, testimonies from other members who remember what went down. Ray nodded. You'll need more than 3 emails if you want to stand up to the fire. Agrosphere will throw your way. But I'll back you. I can't officially reopen anything unless we get the DA involved, but I can help you gather names. People who were there. People who saw it fall apart. I appreciate that. Hank said quietly. Ray studied his old friend. You sure about this? This'll stir up more than just bad memories. You're poking a hornet's nest with a damn stick. Hank looked up, eyes clear for the first time in years. That co-op wasn't just a business, it was our way of life, and they buried it like it never mattered. But it did, and it still does. Someone has to speak for what we lost. Ray leaned back again, nodding slowly. Then let's dig, Hank. Let's finally dig. They spent the next hour going over names. Walter Finch, of course, several other surviving members, Martha Lynn, who'd handled the co-op's books, Caleb Norris, who'd sat in on the final investor meeting. Ray pulled out a notepad and began jotting down leads, contact numbers, even where they'd moved to. As Hank stood to leave, Ray walked him out to the porch. The morning sun had risen high, warming the cracked sidewalk and illuminating the dusty patrol truck parked out front. I always knew you had fight left in you, Ray said, squinting toward the horizon. I just needed the right ghost to wake it up, Hank replied. Ray chuckled. Well, looks like the past is finally ready to talk, and maybe this time someone will listen. As Hank stepped off the porch, the file folder tucked under his arm, the wind picked up gently through the wheat fields beyond town. The sign across the road still read, Welcome to Eldridge, where community matters. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like a cruel joke. It felt like a promise worth keeping. The early morning sunlight filtered through the dusty blinds in Hank Brody's kitchen, casting long streaks of pale gold across the oak table where he sat hunched over a stack of old files and printouts. His hands moved methodically, calloused fingers sorting documents, photographs, and emails he had gathered over the last week. On top of the pile sat a flash drive, small and unassuming, but heavy with years of betrayal. Across the table sat Emily, fresh off a 4-hour drive from Tulsa, eyes locked onto the contents of her laptop. She had taken Hank's evidence and matched it with her own findings, bank records, land acquisition documents, and leaked Agrosphere board memos. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Brody Co-op wasn't just a casualty of poor planning or market failure, it was deliberately gutted, and the man holding the knife was Ethan Caldwell. I need to forward this to someone I trust, Emily said without looking up. You said you had a contact at Channel 12? Hank asked, his voice low, tired. Not just a contact, she replied. Rosa Mendel. She's an award-winning investigative reporter. She covered the Big River nitrate spill 2 years ago. If anyone can shine a light on this without letting it get buried, it's her. Hank nodded slowly. Then let her have it all. Emily copied the files and hit send. A silent pulse of electricity ran through the room, like something irreversible had just happened. That evening, the town of Eldridge buzzed with quiet anticipation. Word had spread that Channel 12 News would be airing a special segment at 7 p.m. about something that happened close to home. No one knew exactly what it was, but in a town where news typically meant lost livestock or a bake sale, the buzz alone was enough to fill the local diner by 6. At precisely 7 p.m., televisions across Eldridge and across the state flickered to life. Rosa Mendel appeared on screen, seated at her signature exposed brick news desk. Her tone was measured, her gaze direct. Tonight, we bring you a story that has long remained in the shadows, a story of promises made and broken, of livelihoods destroyed in the name of progress, and of a quiet man who decided it was time to speak. The screen faded to archival footage, grainy clips of Brody Co-op in its heyday, tractors plowing together across wide fields, farmers shaking hands over sacks of corn, a community working in harmony. Then came the collapse. Empty silos, for sale signs, foreclosures, newspaper clippings that read like tombstones. Over these images, Rosa's voice narrated, in 2015, the Brody Agricultural Cooperative, once a cornerstone of rural development in Kansas, collapsed under the weight of a sudden and inexplicable funding freeze. Documents obtained by Channel 12 now confirmed that the withdrawal was orchestrated by Agrosphere Inc. and signed off by then financial strategist and now CEO, Ethan Caldwell. Cut 2, a high-resolution image of Ethan Caldwell giving a TEDx talk in San Francisco about innovative capital strategies for agribusiness. A still frame of his signature at the bottom of a critical contract. a short clip of him walking into Agrisphere headquarters in a tailored navy blue suit. Rosa's voice didn't falter. Mr. Caldwell, who now leads one of the largest agricultural investment firms in the country, declined to comment when approached by our team. But his digital fingerprint is everywhere, from internal memos recommending the strategic dismemberment of non-performing cooperatives to emails suggesting Eldridge be treated as a write-off zone. At home in his downtown apartment, Ethan Caldwell stared at the television, stunned into silence. He didn't even register the glass of bourbon in his hand, slipping from his grip until it shattered on the floor. The television continued. We interviewed former co-op members, including Hank Brody, whose name the organization bore. According to Brody, promises were made by early-stage investors about sustainable growth and community preservation. But once Agrisphere gained controlling shares through proxy partners, priorities shifted to asset liquidation. A clip showed Hank sitting on his porch, voice steady, eyes sharp. "We thought we were building something for our kids," he said. "Turns out we were handing the keys to people who never planned to stay." The camera cut back to Rosa, her voice tinged with finality. "We reached out to the USDA and multiple rural oversight commissions. Several confirmed they are reviewing the evidence and reopening investigations previously closed without explanation." Across the screen, a bold headline appeared: "Brody Co-op Collapse. Who Killed Rural Hope?" Within an hour of the broadcast, Agrisphere's corporate phone lines were jammed. The company's board of directors, most of whom hadn't even heard of Eldridge until that moment, held an emergency virtual meeting. "Ethan," one board member said curtly over the video call, "what the hell is going on?" Ethan, pale and tight-lipped, stared at his laptop. There were decisions made years ago. Strategic reallocations, legal, defensible. "Spare us the jargon," another cut in. "Your face is on TV right now being labeled the man who gutted a town. Our share price dropped 7% in the last hour. Do you realize how damaging this is?" Another voice chimed in. "We need a response, immediately. A public statement, a press conference, something. And if what they're saying holds up legally, we're going to need to start discussing settlements." But Ethan wasn't listening. His mind was back on the farm, standing in the rain with Hank Brody, asking questions about an old windmill and pretending not to recognize the name on the faded co-op sign. The image of Hank's weathered face haunted him more now than any boardroom threat could. Outside his apartment window, the San Francisco skyline blinked coldly against the night. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt completely, unmistakably exposed. The sun hung low over Eldridge, casting long, amber shadows across the dusty road that led back to Hank Brody's farm. The same road Ethan Caldwell had traveled just nights before, unknowingly stepping into the very place he had helped bring to ruin. Now he returned, not out of necessity, but by choice, driven by something far more uncomfortable than a broken-down truck: guilt. Ethan's black SUV rolled to a slow stop at the edge of the gravel driveway. The once familiar landscape now felt like a living accusation. The crooked barn, the weather-worn windmill, even the faded Brody Agricultural Co-op sign still propped up beside the gate. It all looked the same. But Ethan had changed, or at least he was beginning to. He stepped out, dust curling around his polished shoes, entirely out of place on this soil. As he approached the porch, he saw Hank seated on a wooden bench, hands folded across his lap, eyes hidden beneath the brim of his weathered hat. The old man didn't rise. He didn't speak. He simply waited, letting Ethan cross that final invisible line on his own. "Mr. Brody," Ethan began, his voice uncertain, edged with shame. Hank looked up slowly. His gaze was as steady as it was unreadable. "You found your way back." "I had to," Ethan said, exhaling deeply. "I saw the broadcast. I saw everything." There was a long silence between them, filled only by the breeze shifting dry leaves across the ground. Then Hank stood, the weight of years and unspoken pain evident in the slow creak of his joints. "You saw everything," Hank repeated, voice low. "But did you see us? Back then?" Ethan's face tensed. No, I didn't. And that's why I'm here." Hank studied him for a long moment, then gestured toward the barn. "Walk with me." They moved in silence past the rows of rusted equipment, each machine like a gravestone for the dreams buried beneath this land. Inside the barn, shafts of light pierced through the warped slats, illuminating motes of dust that hung like ghosts in the air. Ethan stopped beside an old wooden table scattered with documents, blueprints, and black and white photos of smiling farmers. Hank among them, much younger, standing proud beside a sign that once read, "First Shipment, Brody Co-op, 1984. "I didn't know what shutting down that investment would do to real people," Ethan said quietly. "I only saw the numbers, the projections, the risk." "The risk," Hank echoed bitterly. "That word took away 30 years of work. It took away my neighbors' homes, their dignity. You want to talk about risk? Try standing in front of grown men and telling them they can't feed their families anymore." Ethan bowed his head. "I didn't know." "No," Hank said, stepping closer. "The problem is, you didn't want to know." That cut deeper than anything Ethan expected. And worse, it was true. He hadn't wanted to look too closely, hadn't wanted to attach real lives to the metrics on his spreadsheets. It had been easier that way, cleaner, until now. "I remember you," Hank said, "from that video conference. You were younger, cocky, telling us Agrisphere had to reallocate funds to higher growth regions. I should have known it was just a fancy way of saying we weren't worth saving." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, a flash of shame rising to his face. "That wasn't my call alone." "But it was your voice we heard," Hank snapped, "your face on the screen when the axe fell." The barn fell silent again, save for the rattle of the wind outside. Then Ethan stepped forward, shoulders heavy. "I'm not that man anymore, Hank. At least, I don't want to be. And I can't undo what happened, but I'm here to ask what I can do. For you, for the people this hurt." Hank leaned on the edge of the table, staring down at a faded photo of the co-op's opening day. "You want to help? Then don't make it about redemption. Don't do it for penance. Do it because you finally see us." Ethan nodded slowly. "I do." The two men stood in that dusty silence, not as enemies, but not yet as allies either. There was still too much pain, too many years gone. But in that moment, something shifted. Just enough. "You should go," Hank said finally. "You've got a lot to think about." "I will, but I'll be back," Ethan replied. "And when I come back, it won't be with a press release or a check. It'll be with a plan, a real one." Hank didn't smile, but he didn't stop him either. As Ethan walked back toward his SUV, the wind picked up again, sending a low groan through the windmill. He paused by the old sign one more time, reading the chipped letters. Brody Agricultural Co-op, 1982 to 2015. But this time, he didn't just see a failure. He saw the people, the stories, the consequences. And for the first time, he let them weigh on him. Back on the porch, Hank remained still, eyes fixed on the horizon. For years, he had lived under the shadow of that betrayal. But now, something about the air felt different. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew the silence was finally broken. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, wrapped in a glossy envelope with Agrisphere's embossed logo, shining like a brand of authority. Hank didn't open it right away. He stared at the sharp black lettering for a long moment, his hands rough and dirt-stained from mending a broken fence post out near the old pasture. It felt heavier than it should, as if the paper inside carried the weight of years that had gone unacknowledged. It was Emily who opened it, her brow furrowing as she skimmed the pages, lips tightening with each line. She read it once more aloud, slowly this time, as her father leaned against the kitchen counter and listened in silence. Agrisphere, through its legal counsel, acknowledged the unfortunate financial outcomes that had affected the Brody Agricultural Cooperative and its members. The company offered a sizable monetary settlement, a lump sum payout to each of the surviving co-op members and their families. The letter used words like reconciliation, finality, and non-disclosure. It also made clear that accepting the offer meant permanently waiving the right to pursue further legal action or make public statements related to the matter. Hank let the silence hang. Emily looked up, her voice softer now. "It's a lot of money, Dad. Enough to rebuild. Maybe even more than what the co-op lost. You wouldn't have to fight anymore." Hank walked to the window, looking out over the wind-blown field where the co-op's main storage barn had once stood before the debt collectors gutted it. His jaw clenched as the past surged forward like a dust storm. Faces of farmers who lost their homes, families forced to move, neighbors turned bitter by desperation. He thought of Walter Finch, his old friend, who now lived in a trailer on the edge of town, half blind, and still paying off debts for equipment he no longer owned. "This isn't a gift," Hank said finally, not turning around. "It's hush money. They're not paying to fix what they broke. They're paying to erase it." Emily sighed, folding the letter in half. "But you could do something with it, Dad. Use it for the community, for the people still here. If you don't take it, someone else will, and it'll be gone." He turned to her, eyes steady but worn. "And what do I say to the ones who aren't here anymore to see it? To the men who trusted me to lead them through that storm and got drowned instead?" "You couldn't have known what they were planning," she replied. "No, but I could have fought harder, so I'm going to now." That night, the lights in Hank's kitchen burned long after midnight. He sat at the table with a yellow notepad and a stack of dusty folders that hadn't seen daylight in nearly a decade. Financial ledgers, land deeds, co-op meeting notes, all pieces of a puzzle that Agrosphere had hoped would stay buried beneath the weight of silence and time. He called Walter and 3 other surviving members of the old co-op board. They met at the Grange Hall the next morning, the same place where the co-op had once held its monthly meetings. The building smelled of mildew and old varnish, but the echoes of the past still lived in the scuffed floors and creaky chairs. Walter rubbed his hands over his face after reading the letter Hank passed around. "So they're finally admitting it, kinda. And they want us to just go away." Hank nodded. "They want us quiet, but we've been quiet too long." The others shifted uncomfortably. One man, Paul Fletcher, who had lost his acreage to foreclosure in 2016, looked down at the floor. "I could use the money, hell, my grandkids could use it, but not like this. Not with a gag in my mouth." Hank leaned forward. "Then don't take it as silence. Take it as seed. We pool it. We build something new, something the bastards at Agrosphere don't own." The room fell into deep thought. No one responded right away, but the expressions on their faces weren't skeptical. They were processing a kind of long-lost possibility. Later that evening, Emily sat across from her father on the porch swing, wrapped in a denim jacket as the sun dipped behind the hills. Crickets chirped in the distance, and the scent of cut hay drifted on the breeze. "You really think people will go for it?" she asked. "They went for the co-op once. Not because it was easy, because it was ours, built with sweat and stubbornness." Emily looked at him with a quiet admiration. "If you're going to do this, I'll help. We'll do it right. Legal structure, press funding, transparency." Hank smiled for the first time in days. "I was hoping you'd say that." The next morning, Hank wrote a formal response to Agrosphere. It was short and plain-spoken, like everything else he'd ever written in his life. He declined the individual settlement, stating that any financial restitution would be used toward creating a public fund for agricultural redevelopment in Eldridge and surrounding counties. He requested that the settlement be redirected as a community grant under independent oversight. He ended the letter with one line: "You can pay for the past, or you can help us build a future. The choice is yours." 2 days later, a courier arrived with a new envelope. No logo, no legal letterhead. Just a single page with Agrosphere's agreement to the proposal, pending community framework and a final legal review. But it wasn't just about legality anymore. For the first time in years, Hank felt something stir inside him. Not anger, not grief, something cleaner, something that felt like resolve. The old field where the Brody Co-op once stood was now alive with purpose again. Not with the roar of tractors or the bustle of shipments, but with hands in the soil, real people, neighbors, friends, digging, planting, and rebuilding what had been lost. The earth was still rich here, still remembered. Under the broad Kansas sky, a new beginning was taking root. Hank stood near the edge of the land, one boot planted firmly in the dirt, the other nudging a row of young tomato plants that were just starting to sprout. Around him, volunteers worked tirelessly. Retired farmers, local families, high schoolers on summer break. Even children ran between the garden beds with watering cans too large for their small hands, their laughter a melody Eldridge hadn't heard in years. The wind carried it through the fields like a hymn of resurrection. He had started small, a few plots carved from the overgrown pastureland, cleared by hand, shovel, and sweat. But word spread fast. Some who had once been co-op members came out of the woodwork, driven not by bitterness, but by a longing to restore something they'd once believed in. Donations came in too, anonymous envelopes slipped under his door, old equipment left in his driveway. No one needed to say it aloud, but the town wanted this. A few yards away, Emily knelt beside a raised bed, patting down mulch around a row of sprouting kale. Her hands were covered in soil, her hair pulled back in a way that reminded Hank of her mother when they were first married. She looked up at him with that same steady fire in her eyes, the one that refused to let the world go on unchecked. After years in Tulsa working as a legal analyst, she had finally come home, not just for Hank, but for something deeper. "I signed the lease on that cabin by the stream," she said, standing and wiping her hands on her jeans. "I figured it was time." Hank smiled quietly, pride and relief mixing like the morning dew on the grass. "It's good land," he said, "sturdy bones." She nodded, like the people who built on it. Later that afternoon, a small crowd gathered near the old windmill that once marked the heart of the Brody Co-op. It hadn't spun in over a decade, its metal blades seized by rust and neglect. But now, after Ethan had personally funded its restoration and overseen the engineering team, the gears clicked, groaned, then slowly began to turn. The blades creaked into motion, catching the wind like a prayer answered too late, but still answered. Ethan stood a few paces back, his suit traded for jeans and a work shirt, sleeves rolled, palms dirty. He looked thinner, worn in a different way now, as if life had carved something human into him that money never could. Cameras clicked in the background. Local news had come for the ribbon cutting, but Ethan didn't look at them. He turned to the crowd, cleared his throat, and spoke. "There's no speech that can erase what was done," he began. "No check that makes it right. But I've stepped down from Agrosphere, effective last week. I've liquidated my shares, and the proceeds are being reinvested right here, into independent farming education, into sustainable seed banks, into real people like all of you. Not to buy forgiveness, but to earn the right to try." A quiet hush followed. No clapping, no grand applause, just honest silence. Hank met his eyes from across the field, no nod, no smile, but Ethan didn't flinch. As the sun dipped low and cast long shadows over the newly turned rows, Hank walked slowly toward the windmill. The wind had picked up, warm and constant, tugging at his shirt, rustling the tall grass that had begun to grow again. He reached out and touched the base of the windmill, cool, solid steel, and looked up as its blades turned freely, cleanly, proudly. 10 years it had stood still. 10 years it had been nothing more than a monument to loss. Now it was a beacon. He took off his weathered cap, pressed it to his chest, and whispered under his breath, "We're not done yet, Mary. We're just getting started." From the porch, Emily watched her father in silence, arms folded, tears slipping freely down her cheeks. And under that vast Kansas sky, open and unbroken, the land bore witness not just to a second chance, but to the stubborn, unwavering faith of a man who refused to let the past define the future. The co-op was gone. The pain still lingered, but the soil remained, the sky remained, and so did Hank Brody. He would grow something from all of it, something honest, something that couldn't be bought or sold, something that would last. If you're still here, thank you. Stories like Hank Brody's aren't easy to tell. They're not wrapped in shiny endings or swept away with Hollywood flair. They sit with us. They ask us to remember, to reckon, and sometimes to rebuild. Maybe you saw a part of yourself in Hank, a fighter holding on when everything said, "Let go." Or maybe you've lived in a town like Eldridge, where the wind whispers the names of people who tried to hold something together when the world called it unprofitable. But here's the thing. This wasn't just a story about a broken co-op or a slick executive who came back to face what he helped destroy. It was about the power of truth, the kind that doesn't always roar, but refuses to stay buried. And in a world that too often forgets the people who grow the food, fix the trucks, and weather the storms, literally and figuratively. We're here to remember them, to honor them. One story at a time. So now, we want to hear your voice. Have you ever witnessed something small become something sacred, then watched it get taken away? Have you ever seen someone redeem themselves, not with words, but with work? Scroll down, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what this story stirred up in you. Let's make this more than a channel. Let's make it a conversation. Because every town has a Hank, and every Hank deserves to be heard. And if this story moved you, if it made you pause, reflect, maybe even tear up, hit that subscribe button. Not because we need numbers, but because we're building something here, brick by brick, story by story. A home for the kind of storytelling that doesn't flinch, doesn't fake, and doesn't forget. On this channel, you'll find more than just narratives. You'll find a tribute to resilience, to the land, to the quiet dignity of those who refuse to disappear. And trust us, what comes next is just the beginning. The next story? It might be about a sunflower farmer who stood between her field and a billionaire developer, or an old farmer who fixed a stranger's engine and uncovered a secret tied to America's past, or a mother who renovated an old farmhouse, only to find the FBI knocking at her door the next morning. You won't want to miss what's coming. Subscribe, comment, share, stay with us. Because in a world that moves too fast, we're here to slow down and remember who we are. We'll see you in the next one.